Five, four, three, two, one. I'm Lance Moy. This is Conversations Under Quarantine. I have Josh Gellers with me today. He is a professor of political sciences at the University of North Florida. And today we're going to be talking about our country, our world, ourselves, and how they all relate to one another. Josh, could you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me on. It's really great to have these sorts of conversations, especially now that we're all sort of distant, but at the same time trying to find ways to come together and have meaningful dialogue about important issues. As you mentioned, I'm primarily an academic, and I focus on environmental politics and human rights, especially in the developing world. But I've also worn a few other hats as well. I've worked a lot of retail jobs in my life. I've worked for CVS. I worked for Sierra Club. I've done some consulting for the United Nations. So I'd like to think anyway that I have a pretty well-rounded perspective on a lot of things. But really, as we were sort of discussing even before we began recording, one of the things I think that we have in common is just this desire to understand why people behave the way they do. That really underlies everything. I mean, I've been asked plenty of times before, why did you choose the environment, or what got you interested in political science? And I think my answer would be similar to what you had said, which is just, I'm interested in why people behave the way they do. I just happen to apply it in these specific circumstances. And so I'm looking forward to kind of teasing out how this applies to some concrete and relevant current events that we're hopefully going to dive into.
Excellent. And you know what, man, I appreciate you for coming on here because you and I usually carry most of our discourse through social media. And I'm always such a huge fan of whenever you post something because it's never just a blanket opinion. You always provide a great deal of data that supports not only your opinion, but you're also always willing to reach out to people from both sides of the aisle. I mean, I've seen engagements between you and people who think exact opposite of you, but you two always seem to reach out to one another, and if not find an amicable common ground, you at least keep it civil. And both parties always try to end up articulating themselves in the manner in which their opinion was formulated. And I'm just always such a huge fan of yours on social media, and I'm very happy to have you on here today. And I can't wait for this conversation to unfold. And I think we'll probably start off with, since we said country, world, and ourselves, I think that we'll go with country first with 500. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about the state of our nation in relation to COVID-19, some of the tribalism that seems to have really been super amplified throughout this entire endeavor. And I wanted to know your thoughts as to how tribalism is affecting some of the data, the logical and relevant data that could not only help the individual, but also help the entire group that we're all part of as American citizens move forward and get through this thing together.
Yeah, it's, the area that I think I can make an immediate connection to is climate change. Because, we were talking about this 30, 40 years ago, there wouldn't be the same degree of politicization of this particular scientific issue. But what we've seen over the past few decades increasingly is more polarization around issues that previously were not, or were viewed as sort of outside the pale of political topics. But where there are ramifications, policy decisions, potentially electoral fortunes being shaped by decisions by policymakers, we see them being used for political purposes. And so just like climate change, COVID-19 and the coronavirus have been heavily politicized by both parties. And we can see that the worldviews that people have and the ideologies that they're bringing to the table affect how they're translating the science and the messages that they're receiving from both scientists and policymakers. And layered on top of all of that, as I've said to someone earlier today when we were debating this on Facebook, is the fact that the general public has a very poor understanding of statistics, of research methods. You kind of intimated, a little bit of logic as well. And it makes it very frustrating to have high-level conversations about what should be done in terms of a global pandemic with national consequences. And so in this particular instance, like in climate change, it's both tribes right-leaning and left-leaning, are interpreting the scientific information through the lens of their own ideology. And that is having, effects, knock-on effects on public discourse. So whether it's, the people who are wearing, sort of like heavily armed in Texas, who are right-wing and who are, trying to push back against lockdown orders, or people on the left who are, erring more on the side of caution in terms of the uncertainty that we have, respecting the scientists, acknowledging the fact that we have a great deal of scientific uncertainty. And then on top of all that, you have, as some people, James Weatherall, for example, talked about this in a webinar yesterday as part of UC Irvine's webinar series about the misinformation that's going on right now. And it is enhanced by the fact that articles are being published, or at least put online, before they have fully been vetted. And then media is translating them both in sort of right-leaning or left-leaning ways. And so both tribes, so to speak, are glomming onto the messages that reinforce their existing beliefs. And it's just kind of resulting in more and more culture clash between the different political orientations. So there's a lot of things that are going on now. It would be interesting to kind of paint the whole mental model of that. But you've got tribalism. You've got the way that the media sort of taps into that. You have these deep-seated moral values and political orientations that people are really strenuously hanging on to because that's how they choose to interpret the world. And that's resulting in conflict when it comes time to discussing this, whether it's in government or in social media.
Yeah, I found it extremely fascinating because when we think of liberal thinkers and we think of conservative thinkers, you really would have felt, well, outside of remove the armed protests for getting back to quote unquote normal life, you would have, classically speaking, you probably would have felt that, or at least I, based upon my understanding of the conservative way of thinking, is that they would have been the ones who would have been looking for that accountability, for the caution, for the stay home, let's ride this thing out together. But what wound up happening is that they became absolutely, I guess a very base term would be riled up by their deity. And in this case, it's Donald Trump, who's a very, very divisive speaker. He speaks in such a manner that really, he may not realize it, but what he is doing is he's actually tapping into the insular cortex of an individual. He's finding the negative portion of their brain, and he's stoking on the fear. You can't trust what other people are saying. So get out en masse, armed to the teeth, and voice your opinion. Be free Americans. So people are taking some of the buzzwords from what it means to be an American. Free. They're taking the idea that they can be fully armed, that it's their Second Amendment right to do so, and that they're getting back to normal life, that they're not afraid. So these are all ideas of power. So they're trying to latch onto his power, and his power is usually exhibited in the interactions that he has with media. You'll see him when he speaks to reporters. I mean, he talks to people in such a way that either demeans them. So no matter what they say, if they ask him any logical question, or even if they're baiting him on a question, he doesn't answer like an adult. He really answers like somebody who is extremely guided by the motivations of not having to give a clear answer, especially when he doesn't have one, which seems to be the case 95% of the time. And all the people that you would have felt to be conservative have actually flipped their lens. They're the ones going out. They're the ones braving this virus, so to speak. And what has happened on the opposite side of that is that where the logic is, where the statistics are, where the scientists are, by and large, they're in the liberal camp. And there's just become this, as you talked about, this kind of like a tribal culture clash between these two parties, these two groups. And we're looking for common ground, obviously, common humanity. And usually in group identity, that's the thing that suffers the most. It's the most difficult thing to elicit is common humanity. Because you can take, I think Jeffrey Green did a study on involving political science students, second-year political science students. And he gave them two topics. the most relevant one was welfare. And he said, so generous amount or a small amount. And he noticed that everybody seemed to initially vote based upon what their political leanings were. And then when he assigned a series of seven policies that were sub-policies to a welfare program, a proposed welfare program, he purposely mislabeled them to be, so a Democratic policy, he labeled Republican, and so on and so forth. And he knows that 50% of the time people would vote against their own interests just as long as they felt that they were voting with their group. Mm-hmm. And, so while they would be afraid of being wrong, they'd rather be right with the group rather than be personally wrong about something. And the old, fist pounding on the table for conservatives was, we need accountability. There needs to be accountability in our financial system. There needs to be accountability all through legislatively, in the realms of jurisprudence, every which way they can. But what has happened is that they've seen themselves so different from the left that they've distanced themselves so far from the left that they're nowhere near a center. Mm-hmm. And you're experiencing this, or at least I think we're all experiencing this when it comes to how people react to the information at hand. Conservatives are seeing nine doctors, and I'm throwing out that arbitrary number, it's not specific. Throwing out, 9 doctors hear the same thing, they could hear it from 9,000 doctors, but they'll see one YouTube video of some physician, and they'll go, there's the smoking pistol, right there. We're the ones being disenfranchised now, because they've been the ones for so long who that have been either labeled or found guilty of disenfranchising others. So now they finally found something in which that they're the victim. So now we're going to grab our guns. We're going to go to government buildings. We're going to march around. We're going to stop. We're going to try to open back up the world. We're going to be brave. And this tribalism, where there's no common humanity, is only leading us to the furtherment of what we're going through, because nobody's really accepting of the truth at this point. Fauci, who's served under, I can't really count how many presidents. I think he's been around since Carter. So he's been a specialist who's worked with presidents from both sides. Mm-hmm. He's worked with 3 Democratic presidents, and I think this would be his 4th Republican president. And he pretty much dealt with everything as an adult, right down the middle, as a pure scientific centrist. And that's what my understanding of science truly is to try to find the central facts of any issue. Nothing that looms deeply in the periphery of your imagination or your opinions. It's to find the truth regardless of whether it agrees with you or not. And I know that the conservative pundit, Ben Shapiro, loves to say facts don't care about your feelings. This is a realm in which that, while that becomes a cheerful moment whenever they hear him speak it, in this regard, people are ignoring the facts and they're hurting everyone's feelings on their side. So, I mean, it's tremendously, it's absolutely divisive what we're going through right now with that. And I imagine with you as a professor of political science, you're probably experiencing this more and more in your interactions with people, because you can see it at a different level than other people can. This is where education comes in. Yeah,
it's weird starting your job knowing that instantly, just because of the job you have, people hate you. It's a very weird feeling, because you work so hard. You're trying to become an expert in this very narrow slice of the world. You graduate after anywhere from 5 to 10 years, and then you sort of if you make your way into the academy as like a professor, instantly people discredit you. And I am not aware of any other country in the world where people are greeted with such suspicion based primarily on their educational attainment levels. Part of that is a very insidious and successful propaganda effort on behalf of right-wing think tanks and media to demonize, professors all over the United States. I've had one interesting ongoing dialogue with someone who's a family friend who regularly sort of lambastes me for, indoctrinating children and just doing a really bad job of educating people in this world. And the irony that I've pointed out numerous times is that this is someone who doesn't believe anything unless they personally experience it. So every time I bring up a statistical analysis or a report or a journal article, this person will completely dismiss it out of hand, saying like, well, polls are fake because, it's someone calling someone on a phone and there's selection issues. I mean, not that they would even know that, but that's sort of baked into what they're critiquing it for. And then I say, okay, well, fine. If you think that what I do is so bad and so wrong, why don't you audit a college course? You've never been to college, and yet you argue that the only way you can know things about the world is through direct experience. So you're arguing in a sense that you have no right to make the criticisms you're making because you yourself haven't experienced them firsthand. So why don't you go into a college and enroll, as a visiting student or something like that, and see, is it as terrible as the right-wing media tells you it is? And what you'll find out very quickly is in 95% of the classes, there aren't even political issues that come up. Political science obviously is sort of an outlier there, because of course that's sort of the bread and butter of what we're doing. But what happens is a salience effect kicks in. Someone picks up on one professor at one university who did something crazy once, and then they broadcast that for 24 hours and say, this is all professors everywhere. And someone who is getting that steady drumbeat from their social media, from other forms of media consumption, they then begin to think of these as demonstrative of professors writ large. And that's where we get into issues. So that's to me, it's a cognitive problem.
Cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. And in confirmation bias, right? Just like you pointed out, that particular video that you were referencing is a great example, because the same person, in fact, that I was mentioning a moment ago, made that very argument that, we're supposed to believe all this stuff from all these doctors, but here's the one doctor that we should believe in. And I wrote to this person, you are basically giving a masterclass in confirmation bias. You found a doctor who agrees with the vantage point that you are trying to argue is right. And then you're saying that this is the only valid source of knowledge and truth. I said, what are we going to do with all these other doctors? All of them are wrong, except for the one that you happen to agree with, but they couldn't see it because they're so ideologically wed, and because of the tribalism that they're using to funnel information.
And it's interesting when you look at that particular video and you see, okay, let's ignore the 9,000 or 9 million other doctors in the world. Let's just talk about two. Let's talk about the one in that video. And let's talk about Dr. Fauci. So how did he become the most discredited, most distrusted, and absolutely incompetent doctor according to one side? And how did this other person become elevated to this deus ex machina, this hero, this God from the machine, the thing that explains away all of the things that they can't explain? And this is where individuals who cannot accept statistics typically lure themselves, and they leap at it. They leap at that deus ex machina, that God from the machine, this beautiful heroic figure that comes out of ether without any explanation whatsoever, and somehow rights the wrongs that they're unable to comprehend or unwilling to comprehend. And so on one side we have this doctor who's now been elevated to this mythical sort of status as this heroic figure. And then now you've got the villain, you've got Fauci, because Fauci's standing directly behind the president and he contradicts the president. So immediately he's become the villain to the president. He's become an enemy to the ultimate deity. So it's like, if you're an enemy to Samuel, then you must be the ultimate enemy to Jesus Christ. So we're seeing a lot of that in the optics here. We're seeing that with these peculiar videos. And I actually had a conversation, I'd like to call it a conversation, but it was more so an argument with somebody in social media where they were championing that they work in a setting in which there's 700 people and 24 people were suspected of having COVID-19. Three came back positive. None of the three died. And he goes, I just don't understand why the hell I'm rubbing shoulders with 700 people a day. It's a company of 24,000. So automatically it jumped from 700 people that he's rubbing shoulders with to the entire company, 24,000. He doesn't reference any statistics from the other, 23,700. He just talks about himself. And, I said, okay, what would you like to see happen? And he's saying, well, there's a new bill that's going to be coming out, and it has to do with contact tracing. And they're going to be able to trace your movements, your thoughts, everything. I said, okay, now I'm not going to argue that because I haven't really read it, so I'm not going to dive into that. But let's just dive into the psychology or the philosophy behind the two. You currently use a credit card, don't you? And he goes, yeah. I said, how many purchases would you say you make a day? And he goes, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12. And I said, okay. Then you use your cell phone. He goes, yes. I see your cell phone actually pings to towers, and it's nearby. That's how you get such great service, by the way. And you're tracked by your purchases. So if there really was this terrifying, nefarious plot to put people into positions in which that these conspiracies, these low-level, localized conspiracies to the individual, it could be imposed. That's already there. They could already do it. And his argument, his retort to that was, well, now they can do it to a greater effect. So if there was a murder that took place in my neighborhood, and I happened to be driving by it at that time, they can now link me to this thing without any evidence. But you don't have any evidence that they could do such a thing. And it's this stoked fear that somebody's out to get them, and that somebody is their political enemy. It's the left. The left is the one that wants to take away your freedoms. They're the ones who want to turn us into Soviet Russia. They want to turn us into Maoist China. They want to turn us into these places in which we're automatonic. And it's sad because as I'm listening to him rattle off these different ideas as to what's going to happen and why he's fearful of them, as you can't provide any statistics as to what you're concerned about. He was like, well, I just think that this whole thing could go away if we isolated, the people who are at risk. I said, okay, that's an interesting concept. I said, I'll play ball with you on this. How do we determine who's at risk? Because if we go by the statistics that you don't like, 54% of those individuals are men. So between the ages of 50 and 71 is the most affected group. 54% of the affected group are men. And then you got people who go down in subcategories. So it's people who suffer from hypertension, cancer patients, individuals that are immunocompromised either through some sort of medication or through the natural virtues of what they're experiencing from an infectious perspective. I said, so who gets to determine this? Now you're ceding back that territory to a government that you don't trust to deal with your guns. Now you're going to choose them to arbitrarily deal with something that is purely opinion-based. But you can't trust the statistics. So whose statistics do you trust? And he was like, well, I just think that isolation is best. I said, but if you cannot articulate as to why and how it would be implemented best, then you're offering this blanket statement that is damaging, because you're spreading that sort of fear, that hysteria, and this solves all, this one size fits all, Deus ex machina, a hero to emerge from the abyss to solve all the problems that our world is going through. And that's just illogical from every perspective. It's not logical from the psychological perspective. It's not logical from the expressions of the psychological, which are statistical. We track people through statistics based upon their emotions. And some of these emotions are biologically ingrained. So tribalism is an ingrained thing, but it's amplified by environment. And we're seeing the fanned flames of environmental tribalism. And there's no statistics to back up their side, but there's a ton of statistics to show that they're being the most tribal group humanly possible, literally humanly possible. And I'm just staggered at that disconnect in this discourse between individuals. And you as somebody who references statistics constantly, that's why I'm one of your biggest fans on social media and even in conversation, is because, like I said, psychology is the understanding of the human mind, and statistics in relation, especially in political sciences, behavioral sciences, deals in the actual expression of what people are feeling, and it confirms it. It shows that this is no longer just a theory or an opinion. It's been tried out over a period of, whether it's 4,000 years, 40 years, doesn't really matter. It's been shown to be something that is broadly expressible.
And I think to that point, it's really complicated when you are trying to express something in a mathematical form, but people don't understand that there is a confidence interval and that there's uncertainty. And so, as I was explaining to someone today, one of the major problems is the human mind wants to sort of sift things into boxes, right? That's our tendency. We want to be able to classify things to make the world more easily understandable and to allay our fears. So if we understand that this thing, which is a saber-toothed tiger, can cause harm to us, we're going to put it in the harm box. And this thing, which is a mole rat, is not really going to cause us any harm. So we're going to put it in the harmless mole rat box. That's how our brains work. So statistics is a lot murkier than that. And not even to mention doing things like diagnostic testing and robustness checks and stuff like that, which would just make people's heads spin around. But it's already difficult enough to try and communicate the sorts of things you're talking about, where, like just think of something as simple as a projection, not a prediction, which people mistakenly use, a projection regarding the number of deaths, right, caused by COVID-19. That is going to incorporate a lot of different factors depending on the model that's used. Some models have proven to be better than others. If we, an analogy that might be more relevant, especially for people in Florida, is like a hurricane model. And typically hurricane models are based off of statistical, but not dynamical evidence. So just statistical evidence is just how many hurricanes have there been, say, in the past 10 years. And then we kind of take the average of that, and maybe you add a couple of other independent variables, and you say, okay, well, crunching all those numbers, we would expect as a projection, but not a definitive prediction, that we're going to get anywhere from 3 to 5 hurricanes, right? It doesn't tell you the severity, it doesn't tell you where they're going to land. That's kind of the status of that. A dynamical model would include aspects of the atmospheric circulation models as well. And that's a lot more complicated, so it introduces more opportunities for errors. But it gives you more information than if you were just looking at previous numbers of, the past 5 or 10 years. But the problem is that the way that people want to interpret something like the COVID-19 virus is, how many deaths are we going to get? Give me an absolute number. And then when the number is above or below that, there's a reason to suspect either the scientists or the government agency or the president of the United States. But the reality is there are error bars. And so we know, this is the point that I try to make with people who say we should have never done lockdown measures at all. I say, here's the one thing that's completely inarguable. Had we not done that at all, the death toll would absolutely have been higher. Okay, so that's not even a debate. So then the question becomes, like I was saying at the beginning, having a conversation about the costs and benefits of the risks to public health versus the threats to the vitality of the economy. And then it gets down to, how much is a human life worth? I'm smart enough to know I shouldn't be making that kind of a decision. I wouldn't want to have the sort of moral problems hanging above my head if I were in charge of something like that. But there was actually a really interesting podcast, I think it was an episode of Freakonomics, where they interviewed the guy whose job it was to calculate the value of a human life for payouts from the 9/11 fund. And so there are people who use mathematical techniques to determine, well, someone was 35 years old and they were a mailman versus someone who was 18 and about to go to college. How much money should they get out of this fund based on their expected earning potential over the course of their life? So all this is to say that the human mind wants us to be able to make things as simple as possible so that we can avoid unnecessary threats and mitigate those sorts of things. But the reality is much murkier than that. And that's where we're seeing a conflict between, say, the official reporting statistics and then people who have no training in statistics at all, doubting the veracity of those numbers, other people challenging the very fact that, we were supposed to have 1 million deaths and we only have less than 100,000, so we're doing great. We're going to see the political messaging around this calibrated to the best possible scenario if you're a Republican, and more towards how we undershot, if we were talking about on the Democratic side. So this is something I said maybe a few days ago is likely to happen, that Trump, realizing that we're basically almost guaranteed to have over 100,000 deaths, is going to make the argument that the economy is recovering and that we don't have as many deaths as we otherwise might have. But the very reason why we don't have an exponentially larger number of deaths is because of the lockdown measures. So again, all this is to say that there are human tendencies that would make us want to simplify the world, but then those are being funneled through our political orientations. And so we want to be on the winning team, and we want to have the winning message, especially because we're coming up against an election in November.
Yeah, and whenever I look at that, I see that as there's a portion of the brain, as you talked about, the difference between a feral cat, and what'd you say it was
a mole rat?
Mole rat. There we go.
Yeah.
And so we have parts of our brain that are automatic, and they're parts of our brain that are manual, just like a camera would be. And while the automatic is good at catching most images, it can tend to either have an overexposure or underexposure. And this is the reason why somebody who actually knows how to use the manual side of a camera or manual function of a camera, if it so has one, to actually fine tune it and get the clear image. Now that takes a great deal of expertise. It takes time, it takes study. And people, by and large, they'll look at a political scientist per se, a professor of political science, no less, and they'll think of a person having a private conversation they're not privy to. And they're looking for an automatic conversation. They're looking for something that doesn't require a great deal of depth, something that doesn't require all that extra work. They're looking for that heroic figure, even at a base level. And so those things are being kicked on in the individual. And then as you talked about, the political arm of it all is kind of lassoing the individual that's already confused in the automatic state and then pulling them closer to them. And what winds up happening there is the person who saw something in one narrow lens in an automatic neurological sense is now tying themselves to everything else that the political arm espouses. So it might be, all right, well, I think that we should be open faster than we typically should, than what we're experiencing right now. And then the political side has kind of piggybacked all these different things, the freedom of speech, the Second Amendment issue, the privacy issues, all these different things have become piggybacked. And the person feels overwhelmed, and they're not going to back down from their initial position because they can't understand the manual method. At least they're not willing to, for whatever reason. And they take all these extra philosophical burdens on, and then they take on that personality and they get entrenched. They're part of that deep group. And they definitely don't want to feel as if they're betraying the group, because typically what happens when you betray your group is you become absolutely decimated by your group. And people are, I guess in a word, either not brave enough, or they just don't have the energy to deeply dive into that. And the politics behind it is clearly it's amplifying, it's staggering everything. And there's no doubt about it, as you pointed out, and the statistics are absolutely clear. There's not a real debate there that if we hadn't begun the lockdown when we did, we'd have X amount of more deaths than we would have right now. It'd be a lot more. We can't really put an exact number, or at least I can't. Maybe somebody else has a model for that. But even then, even that model has a degree of variance. And all of this political infighting, all this lassoing for the attention of people who are on the automatic lens right now. And then the people who have the manual lens, and there's not many. And I think there's a quote from the movie Men in Black from our generation, which is where the agent that Tommy Lee Jones plays, and he's talking with the young Will Smith character, I think Agent J, Agent K. And he says, why don't we just tell the people about this? I can understand it, And K says something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing, a person is a rational, logical entity, but you put that person in a group of people, and people are raving mobs, and they won't know what to do with themselves. And it's true, but when the group overhears that, they get insulted by that, and then they only show the tendencies of the mob group even more so. So it's always it's maddening to see that.
And I think that one of the things that I try to explain that I do in my classes is to teach critical thinking, and the way that I usually characterize it is I teach people how to think, not what to think. But I realized by having a recent conversation with people who were, again, on the side of doubting the importance of continuing social distancing, or the CDC making incorrect recommendations and things like that, that once I drilled down a little bit further into what they meant when they were saying that they themselves were engaging in critical thinking, I realized that they didn't actually mean what they were saying. They misinterpreted the term critical thinking to mean I am someone who challenges what I perceive as the conventional view. And as I explained to them, you should always challenge things. And I in the lecture that I teach about what I call how to be a smart consumer of news, that is a bullet point that you should always challenge convention. And that's irrespective of what the conclusion is or what political party you're affiliated with or anything like that. It's fine to always challenge convention and dominant narratives. The problem is when people don't have the toolkits to be able to discern good arguments from bad arguments. Mm-hmm. So this is why, going back to that example of the YouTube video of the doctor, these individuals who were promoting that as the singular vision of truth about the lockdown measures and what we should continue or not continue to be doing with respect to the coronavirus were not in fact engaging in critical thinking. What they were doing is, as I mentioned, engaging in confirmation bias. They discounted everything else they read. They found the one thing that seemed to agree with their pre-existing beliefs, and then they vaunted that as the truth. And what I said, the problem is that you don't have the tools to determine whether what that doctor is saying is accurate or not. So again, it is fine and in fact necessary to critical thinking to challenge what people are saying, whether it's your congressman or a scientist or your teacher, whomever. But then you've got to have the tools to be able to do that. And I think that's where we're severely lacking. We don't arm people with the tools that they need in order to discriminate those good arguments from bad arguments.
I couldn't agree more there. And I'm actually curious, being an educator, do you think that we ought to be introduced to this style, this actual, not style, but actual critical thinking at an earlier age than we tend to be, which in some cases it would be, you know, your mid-high school years if you're in some of the AP classes and whatnot, or even for some people in college. Do you feel that it should happen sooner or at least be nudged to sooner, so that way people are more so inclined to accept real critical thinking, learning how to think rather than what to think, and being able to differentiate the difference between when you're teaching somebody how to think and somehow what they arrive at, which is what most people arrive at when they're placed into groups, is we're human beings are socially gregarious. If we put ourselves into situations in which we're lumped with groups, we don't want to displease the group. So one of the methods that I know that has been employed throughout the education field for the last 30 years has been diversity, which is if you put people in groups that are diverse, they're more willing to accept diversity in their group, and they're more willing to accept a diverse outcome. But then you get the individual that's, you know, feels terribly isolated, and they think that you teaching them how to think is teaching them what to think, because what they end up, or what they see the rest of the group arriving at, is the polar opposite to what they think. Mm-hmm. So they think, well, I'm being indoctrinated if I join that side. Mm-hmm. What would you, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually not ever given a lot of thought to when critical thinking should be introduced, but I'll give you sort of two different perspectives, or two related perspectives. One would be as early as possible. Imagine, for example, teaching numbers to a child, and in addition to teaching them numbers, not only explaining that 2 + 2 is 4, but asking them, how do you know there's even 2? Well, you've got to have some basis, perhaps a philosophical one, for knowing somehow that there is, or there are 2 things worth counting in the first place. How can we verify that? You know, so some of that is sort of introducing elements of the scientific method, but in a very kind of lo-fi way early on. I think that would be very helpful for sort of setting the groundwork for people to accept and understand more high-level critical thinking skills later on. I've had interesting experiences as a college professor where I've had 2 real quick examples are helpful for just demonstrating how useful critical thinking is, because I usually incorporate research methods into many of my classes. And so in one of my classes, I have students develop a research project of their own, but it just has to include the comparative method, which is a type of method for using usually a small number of cases and comparing them with one another and trying to derive conclusions. I've had a very, very far left liberal student set out basically to prove that Donald Trump was a fascist. And then she used a rubric, which she found somewhere, and determined actually that it was not the case, that he was a tried and true fascist because he didn't satisfy enough of the criteria. On the other side, I've had a very conservative student who set out to demonstrate that gun control laws were completely ineffective. And so they looked at state level data from Florida before and after some kind of gun control legislation was introduced. And they did a really good job of, in their graph, having a dividing line between the before and after of the implementation of that legislation. And they found exactly the opposite of what they thought based on their political ideology, which was that there was a decrease in gun-related violence after the implementation of this legislation. And I was so proud of both of these students for independently coming to conclusions that do not gel with their political orientations, because they let the data speak for itself and they used the tools that we learned in class to come out with those conclusions. But I've also had instances where someone comes in very hardwired to prove something, like those students might have been. Maybe my saddest moment as an instructor for teaching a class that was intended as a capstone experience for seniors who are graduating was that they left the class thinking that all polls are fake because they're not actually asking people sort of in person about their opinions. And I was like, if that's what you've learned from political science, we have failed. Yeah. Because there's so much more to polling. And I could certainly go on a whole separate tangent about that. But, you know, and I've seen people on the left and right both criticize polling, but for reasons that don't hold water. And to me, that's not necessarily a problem of intelligence so much as they lack the equipment to be able to understand what the poll is saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what ends up happening with so many with the individuals is people are always trying to validate their philosophy, and it takes a great deal to pull them from it, because I know people say that when you go into universities they're indoctrinated, and I'll quote a very conservative thinker who describes himself mostly as a centrist, is Jordan Peterson, who's a internet darling, and he always seems very befuddled whenever somebody, you know, describes him as a conservative, strict conservative or far righter, and you know he vehemently denies it and says, you know, they're not a fan of my work, they're this, that, and the other. And he goes on to these things, and he talks about how the humanities are dominated by 90 some odd percent liberal thinkers, and they did a study on the professors, liberal arts professors, and found out that 70 some odd percent, again, 70 some odd percent, I can't remember the exact percentage, classified themselves as socialist and all this sort of stuff. And he was just saying how students are indoctrinated and how the system is so far backward than what it used to be. 50 years has been a great deal of change. And that was one of the reasons why I think he partnered with some online university, PragerU, and they, you know, I guess for a period of time were engaged in this partnership in which that he was teaching some things online. And I watched some of his stuff because I'd heard about him from a friend of mine. Said, you know, have you ever read Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos and all this sort of stuff? And you speak about chaos and order. And, you know, I think you'd find him really interesting. And I had never really read anything on his before. So I read his book and I listened to him speak in a handful of videos. And much like with almost anything I've ever read or anything that I've learned throughout my life to be able to extract good data and then discard, not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So while he has some good things, and what makes him very enticing is the fact that he does speak on a factual level about some things, but then he piggybacks his own personal philosophies. And he talks about how, you know, children are being indoctrinated. And then he talks about the West. And he talks about the virtues of the West. And the first thing that popped into my head, I was like, that's an interesting concept for somebody who talks of indoctrination, because the fundamental precept to the fundamentals of the West would be the fact that they were indoctrinated in a Judeo-Christian ethos, as he and Ben Shapiro like to constantly paint. Mm-hmm. They say all the virtues of the West become from this Judeo-Christian ethos, and that obviously they've assigned correct indoctrination to that. So it validates their personal philosophy, and they're able to discard anything else, any of the true critical thinking that they refuse to apply to that. And one thing I'll always tell anybody, and it's the best advice I can ever give to anybody who's ever involved in either conflict or debate, is you cannot argue your statement unless you're willing to attempt to argue the inverse of it. Because by doing so, you properly vet your own logic. And it's it's almost like the mechanism at play in a human being's brain when if you're bilingual and you think in the language that isn't your formal language, your native language, you're actually more of a logical thinker. And they've done tons of studies on this to confirm, and they've given people critical thinking questionnaires, and they'll see that the person's far more logical when they're thinking outside of their emotional brain. Because the first languages you're learning from a very emotional lens. You're learning the emotions of the individuals that you were around when you learn a language: mother, father, sister, brother, cousin. Insert, your localized tribe. That's what you're learning your emotions from. And there's a great deal of disdain and distrust when it comes to the idea of indoctrination. But indoctrination usually it becomes disdainful and distrusted when it's not the indoctrination that the person has already received. Mm-hmm. So people are already indoctrinated. This idea that educators are trying to indoctrinate their children into something insidious is where politics become involved. They're trying to teach our children that men and women are more alike than we think. Men are clearly different than women. It's like, okay, well, from some statistics, yes, but and you can see expressions at the extremes. They're trying to tell that this was the argument back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and I guess still even in some spaces of the country now, where people talk about inclusion and diversity. Well, you're telling me to get rid of my identity, my Western culture, in lieu of this other thing, and I'm viewing it as inherently wrong. So this goes back to the automatic and the manual portions of the brain, or at least processing of logic comes from this mechanism. A person will look at the morality of another individual and they'll see it as different, strange, wrong. That's the escalation. Mm-hmm. And that's the escalation of thoughts. And so when they see a professor, they're unable to, if they can't day one and sit down and debate with you, and they can't comprehend your statistics, they're viewing that your statistics are being used to manipulate them. And this is what people do in conflict resolution, or the failure of conflict resolution, sorry. Individuals will be involved in some sort of conflict, let's say either parent, child, friend, co-worker, whatever, what have you. People will try to argue with one another, and when the other person staggers up evidence against them, it becomes a frustrating endeavor. They can no longer prove their point, so they assign mischief to their combatant, the other belligerent in this conflict. You have more facts than I do, and you're throwing them in my face. You're trying to annihilate me with your words, and I find no logic in that, and I find that you're morally corrupt for having done so. But then they're not willing to throw off that mechanism whenever they're trying to get their aim. And their aim is, I don't want to be indoctrinated when I go to school. It's like, well, then why in the hell are you going to school? You do realize that going to school is being indoctrinated into the idea of learning how to think, mm-hmm. and not walking with a preconceived notion and exiting with the same notion. The origin and terminus should never be the same. Anytime you've had a good experience with a professor. I've had some great experiences with professors over the years, and the ones in which that I never arrived at my conclusion at terminus. It was always something that became either enlightened, something I did not know. And this goes to that figure Peterson, where he always, I think one of his popular verbal employments is the listen to others as if they could teach you something. It's some variation of that, and that's good. But when you hear him in all of his interviews, he's extremely combative. He never allows the other person to talk. He laughs a lot, and again, it's the idea that you cannot differentiate the difference between truth and opinion. And this is the reason why there's distrust with politicians, professors, is it's a level of understanding that people either aren't used to or they don't have the energy to actually engage in.
Yeah, there's so much there to unpack, but
Sorry.
I think that it's sort of about an information processing deficit and some of our cognitive tendencies that push us to want to be comfortable. And I was thinking as you were talking about that some of these differences really boil down to kind of two different things: fear and empathy. And just about everything in terms of any kind of policy issue that you can imagine, especially whether we're talking about bailing out companies or should we reopen businesses, it's about fear or it's about empathy. Who do you have empathy for? Is it the business people? Is it the immunocompromised? Is it the workers on the front lines? Is it the politicians who are struggling to understand the science? Is it the scientists themselves? And then the fear, of course, is omnipresent. Fear of having your freedoms taken away. How long will these freedoms be curtailed? Fear of not being able to enjoy going out in public again. But the difference is how you apply those two different things and to what ends. And I think that if you were to look over the political spectrum, you would find that, and I talked briefly before we began about, using moral foundations theory as a way to kind of understand variation in attitudes on many different topics. And the moral foundations underlying conservatives are very different from the moral foundations underlying liberals. So it is the conservatives who glom onto fear much more, which is kind of interesting and ironic in a way, right? Because one of the tropes since sort of 2016 or so has been, liberals are snowflakes who, they're so sensitive and all that. But I would submit that they are the ones who are actually more comfortable with uncertainty and fear things like other people less. So liberals tend to live less of their life in fear than conservatives. On the other side, it's liberals who are exuding empathy. And by that, I don't just mean within your tribe. I mean thinking about someone who could be affected by a policy that you don't know and caring that that person is better off as a result of that. One really easy way to kind of look at how this dynamic plays out is taxation. Right? The fear is that by increasing taxes, it means less money for me to do the things I want, more money used for things I don't like. The empathy is maybe those taxes will be used to help someone I don't know, and that's good. And so I don't know at what point people, this is much more of a psychology kind of question or cognitive science question, but at what point do those values get concretized in someone to where it becomes very obvious, aside from maybe whether their parents were conservatives or liberals, that that's going to be their sort of dominant worldview from here on out? I was one article that I was just looking at recently, which doesn't speak specifically to that, but does look at the role of environmental attitudes in preschool. And what was really interesting was it found that children were very open to a range of perspectives with respect to the relationship to the natural environment. So there's anthropocentrism, which is humans are sort of the natural center of the universe and everything that does should revolve around them. And then there's kind of a biocentric perspective, which is that, things should be done to kind of honor and respect nature and that sort of thing. And then there's ecocentrism, which is a kind of view where we're all part of a whole together. So we are not any more important than a tree or a bird or whatever. And they found that very young children appeared to be more malleable as far as, which I mean, it makes sense, right? Their views are not totally formed yet, but that they seem very receptive to less anthropocentric kinds of explanations. And I think, so somewhere along the line, your attitudes get more hardened, and then it becomes more difficult to shake them. College, as you pointed out, is really, I think of it as an opportunity to disrupt those things that you have now been indoctrinated to believe. A lot of this is, because of your parents, and this is not on the right or left. We know that people typically will sign up for the party that their parents are, so have the same religion that their parents are part of. And so college is an opportunity to set aside those things that you are walking into school with, and to then check yourself and ask, do I still want to do these things? Do I still consider myself to be a conservative or a liberal or a Catholic or a Jew or a Hindu or, whatever? And I think we will have failed if we don't, as a system of education, provide the means of allowing that sort of personal exploration from occurring?
You touched on something really profound there, and it really is at the root of everything. And it's the cementing of one's emotional ideology early on in life. And so Alfred Adler, Jean-Paul Piaget, and a slew of others have observed from the psychological perspective that age 3 to age 7 are the most malleable years of pre-adult life. And we have this extension of childhood as we go into college, if we go to college, because now we have this carved out identity that the world isn't expecting a great deal from you right now. They're expecting potential from you in the future. And what you can gain there, if you're open enough to it, and you don't revert into the same sort of social groups that you had growing up. Like if you go into college looking for that same social group, you're likely to find it, especially if you go to school at a very local level. Students who travel and go to out of state schools, they tend to end up being more open towards the end of their experience in university setting. But children between the ages of 3 and 7, you can explain a great deal of things to them, and they can be indoctrinated in that empathy. They can be, when I say indoctrinated, I really do mean that, because you're indoctrinated at all levels. You're first from birth, you have a certain amount of neurological indoctrination. That's just from millions upon years of this beautiful evolutionary science that makes you and I what we are, these packets of DNA, complex DNA. And then you go to the environmental setting as a small child. If you're around violence, if you're around certain things, you will be more and more inclined to one or the other. And then if you're around a very conservative style of thinking throughout that period of time, and you don't get broken from that, or if you're not at least lured to some sort of logical center in which you can find a balance between fear and optimism. And as people go on in their high school careers, they obviously, most people go off to where they're most comfortable, as you put it. And they'll go to their little cliques, their little groups, whatever it is. And then when they go to university, they have the opportunity to really reprogram themselves. And what I think the main issue, what tends to happen, even on the road to enlightenment, let's say a person does become enlightened when they go to college. They have this resetting. They have 4 years, just like 3 to 7. It's 4 years to be reintroduced to the world. And they become sympathetic to many things. They start looking back at all the things that now they feel included. Now they feel like they understand. They feel enlightened. They feel like they haven't been lied to, that they're finally open to a conversation that makes them feel less guilty about their interactions with others in the world. Then they'll look back at their parents. So if they come from a conservative setting and all of a sudden they start taking on liberal thoughts, they'll assign, not all the time, but most of the time, they'll start assigning their parents as these oppressive monsters. And without having sympathy or empathy for their parents, not understanding that their parents were probably indoctrinated in the same thing, and much of it was out of their control. Maybe they didn't have the opportunities to go to university. Maybe they had to stay at a local level. Maybe they got married too young, and they became further and further and further and further cemented in their ideologies. I think that probably at the university level should be a better emphasis on somehow making the individual who you're enlightening become more empathetic to the people that they came from, rather than shackling themselves. So you have the flip side of that coin, the person that demonizes and the person that deifies. The person that deifies goes to university and they feel like they immediately retreat from these types of enlightening conversations, ones in which that they're not typically comfortable in. And they'll say, you're going against what I was taught growing up. You're the enemy to what I love. You've become they. Us over here, we're comfortable. And you're trying to lure us into a sense of discomfort. And everything that happens after that, they start seeing everybody else on the other side as their pure enemy. And they're willing to invalidate themselves to try to validate their theory. I mean, they will reach for things that are absolutely the exact opposite of what they espouse. So I want to have as less government control as possible. But by the way, I think that this could be solved with isolation, ignoring the fact that to isolate people, the government would have to have, by virtue of sheer logic, they would have to have more control. They would have to have more say in who goes and who goes out. And when I asked that person to elaborate why they felt the way that they felt, they said, well, this thing only affects such a small amount. You know, the weak will go off, but you know, the strong will go on. It's like, okay, you're closing your eyes and imagining that you're not weak, for nobody that you love is weak. And you're using, I'm using his words, weak, not, you know, what I feel the person would be. It's just a person who happens to be infected either by virtue of having some underlying issue or their proximity to that contagion. And there's so much misinformation on how to teach and when to teach. And as you said, those most malleable years really are in that preschool to kindergarten, school setting, where they're age 3 to 7. And the science has been proven on this. 3 to 7 the most malleable years, and you do have an opportunity later in life. That's the reason why education at the university level is so damn important, because it gives the opportunity for the individual to relearn how to rethink and refeel. And if you can learn to refeel something, you might look back and look at your ancestors. Let's say you were born somewhere in the South and your family has leanings towards some sort of romanticization of the Confederacy. Not in the ills of the Confederacy, but of the gallantry and the honor of defending their rights. But they're ignoring the fact that their rights and their honor were tethered to by virtue of that declaration from the Confederate States, that there were so many things, it was tethered to dishonor. It was tethered to not caring about other human beings, actually assigning that other people weren't even human beings. So it would give that person, give anybody, if they were so inclined, if they had the opportunity to go to school at the university setting and truly be enlightened. And if you can get somebody young enough at that preschool setting to give them that initial nudge towards being empathetic. Yeah, they might get deprogrammed, they might get desensitized during their formative years, but by the time they hit school, that trigger could be turned back on. It's there, and it would give them more opportunity to feel comfortable with wandering outside of their preconceived comfort zone.
Yeah, I think that's, I remember from taking a course on adolescent psychology, which was really fascinating because it was totally outside of my wheelhouse, but I needed an elective, and learning about some of the developmental stages, and it's really critical because you establish that sort of sensitivity, like you said, very early on, and that can really set the stage for one's receptiveness to other ideas later on in life. For what it's worth, I think there's a range of personalities that choose to enter college. But what I hope is that everyone, at least when they go through some of my classes, they come out of it with the skills to be able to interpret what they are seeing in the media, conversations they're having with other people, debates with family and coworkers and things like that, and to really feel like they have a strong handle on how to argue effectively. I've also thought about, like, what about people who are going into trade schools who have not been exposed to, political science research methods and might not have the same degree of familiarity with, like, say, how public opinion surveys are administered, how we conduct the sorts of studies that we have, and so on. And I thought, it would be, because someone I know was doing, I think, like, teaching Excel to people in prison. And I thought, like, that's such a great thing to strive to do, because you're going to give some kind of marketable skill to somebody who probably didn't have a chance. If there wasn't this program, they certainly wouldn't have the chance to learn that kind of a skill. And I think, for people who are not being exposed to research methods and statistical techniques and all that, there needs to be some sort of way in which those members of our community are also elevated so that they can be, more knowledgeable participants in a public discourse where they have similar tools that they can use to understand what's going on.
Yeah, and that goes to giving the individual a tool in which that they can help the group. So you're giving somebody the ability to think critically, to argue against themselves. One thing I I stress to any friend is argue against yourself as much as humanly possible. Jeremy Bentham, you know, so Bentham arrived at one of his great conclusions while trying to argue against himself deeply. So he was arguing, trying to find all the arguments in what he naturally felt about homosexuality. And he found that over a period of years that there was no detriment to society. He first wrote down what he felt was wrong about it, why it was wrong, how it could hurt the individual and how it could hurt others. And for years, he struggled with this, and it became the epiphany that changed his entire way of thinking. And when he arrived at, this wasn't something that would hurt humankind. It's not something that hurts the individual. Actually, it's quite the opposite. Trying to stagnate or otherwise impede a person's natural emotions or their natural inclinations, you end up hurting the individual and you end up hurting groups. And when you end up hurting individuals and groups, you disenfranchise a large swathe of the population. And you only create this space in which people who haven't thought critically tether themselves to this animus towards that side, and it only becomes further and further and further, generation after generation after generation. So I always tell people you should argue against yourself as much as possible to find out if you're wrong. And I'm not saying anybody's 100% right about anything, because science is always changing, but it's never changing in such a radical way. Like there's often in debates, and I used to engage at University of College of Charleston, and we did it at University of Virginia once, was a debate on philosophy and psychology, and somebody tried to tell me that if I'm willing to argue against myself, you know, they pulled out, you know, throughout our debate, what do you feel you could be wrong about? Because as we all know, you love science, and science is, they quoted somebody by saying that, I think it was, I can't remember his name right now, it's going to make me angry, but this very famous neurobiologist talked about how science was always changing in its best guess, but they don't look at the rest of that literature, where best guess was more so used to describe one thing versus the entire body of work. Yes, it's best guessed for now, but it's never such a leap and bounds of like, in 1947, we thought apples were God, and in 1952, we were positive, 100% positive that it was oranges. You know, something as menial as that. But we haven't arrived at these things. You'll hear all this misinformation about, up until Columbus sailed the ocean blue, we thought the world was flat. It's like, that's not true at all. It's actually been well known by mathematicians for over 2,000 years, well over 2,000 years. So misinformation mixed with, you know, an ill-timed but well-placed misquotation always leads to a person thinking they've strengthened their argument and lessened yours. And yes, while science is always evolving, and we're always evolving, you can always be wrong about something, but if you're drastically wrong about something, it means that there's a fundamental flaw in the method that you've used, or you've used the correct method. And if you apply that over, you know, 5 or 6 things in your life, and if you notice your life getting better, and if you notice the lives of the individuals around you getting better, you've chosen the right method. But if your heels are dug in, you know, in sense of like conflict with somebody, and you think your method is the best, I've argued against myself, all the virtues point towards me holding my ground. It all has to do with, I've been wrong. As the individual, I've been wronged, and I'm removing myself from any group accountability. Because as a son, as a brother, as an uncle, as a nephew, as a professor, you're an individual, but you're also an individual attached to other individuals. So you're by virtue of that part of the group. And if you're willing to view your actions and how they affect the group, that's always going to be good. I'm not saying it's the only measure for your happiness, but it's the best measure for happiness within a group. Now, if the group is doing things that are demonstrative, so if you disagree with them and your entire family is, you know, rabid racists, and you disagree with them, I would have to think that at some point you could try to translate that knowledge, that method, and you'll find yourself miserable and everybody around you miserable. So you always have to look for virtues, and Maya Angelou says that the highest virtue of all is courage, because you can't practice any other virtue in life without being courageous. can't practice patience without being courageous, because you could be a patient hunter, but a patient hunter is probably somebody that subjects themselves to moments in which they have to be brave and courageous. You know, they have to stand there and be willing to wait for something to get close enough to them to throw a spear, shoot an arrow, insert thing. And I don't want to lump in, I want to make this very clear, just comedically and philosophically, that people who use assault rifles to hunt game animals are not hunters. Whoever watches this, I want to let you know that I vehemently disagree with your need for high-powered rifles to somehow take down a duck. I urge you to look deep within and try to find the logic in what you're doing. It's terrible, and it's just comical. But yeah, I think that we've all kind of we're all approaching the Rubicon, so to speak, as far as critical thinking, how it's implemented in our at the national level, it's at the global level, and how it is at the individual level. And obviously, as a professor, you're somebody who teaches the individual so that they can interact within a group and make the country and then hopefully the world better. If I'm correct on that.
I think that's goal. You know, it's just we arm them with the best information and the best tools, and we hope that will make them more effective critical thinkers and citizens in the world.
So let me ask you a question. With those tools, how do you hope that we all emerge from COVID-19? What would you like to see for us all?
I would like to see a profound respect for science, an acknowledgement about the role that uncertainty plays in decision making, and in a roundabout way, similar to the wake of September 11th, a sort of renewed sense of camaraderie for the fact that we are really all in this together. And, you know, there are, I think, for all the bad stories that we see on television and read about in the news, there are also many good examples of people being good Samaritans and assisting their neighbors, you know, especially those who've been really affected by the economic downturn. And I think that those are the sorts of good things that we should cull from this experience, and realize that in order to achieve collective goals, it does take individual sacrifice, but that together we can work toward a better future and respect each other more and figure out or identify with other people and realize that we are responsible for each other. And I think that's been, you know, someone who studies environmental politics, that's something that has been sort of front and center in that area of scholarship, and that has frustrated, or rather caused a lot of environmental degradation, is very short-term economic thinking that doesn't include holistic views of the world and all the people and animals and the flora and fauna that might be affected by things. So having a better holistic view of the world, I think, is the right thing to do. And, you know, the use of masks is sort of a great metaphor for this, because as the CDC has recommended, it's not only for you, it's so that you can protect other people as well. And so I think I'm hardened actually when I do go out in public and I see people in public spaces, like I've been to grocery stores and home improvement stores, and seeing the volume of people who are totally different walks of life, but all realizing a common commitment to each other. And I think that's a really powerful, beautiful thing that I hope we hold on to and we learn to expand upon.
Josh, I could not agree with you more. And while I asked you the question of hope, I will answer with my fear. And I think that what I fear the most from all of this is the exact opposite of what you described in relation to 9/11, because while we were united at that one portion, I'm afraid that in this unification, if we were ever to find one, which I really hope we do, and I hope that unification isn't weaponized by the politics at hand. to find a common enemy and to scapegoat a common enemy, because that is the, if you go back to the 1960s, and while we know it's a little bit different now, but those were the two fundamental understandings of tribalism, was scapegoating and then empathy on one side. Empathy for your brother, or blaming your brother, Cain versus Abel, so to speak. And my great fear is that people are going to allow themselves to have this unification, if we were to find one, this common ground, this common humility, weaponized and used against common enemies. You'll hear it in certain chatter on media, and I won't say progressive media. I will say, Fox, or from the president's own mouth when he talks about China virus and ask China and all this kind of stuff. I really hope that the diversity and the global inclusion that we have, my fear is that we may retreat from it. And to your hope, I hope that that's not the case. Not at all. I really want to believe that people will fight back against that, because we've come so far in the last 50 years alone. I mean, we've come 5,000 years and 50 years in terms of in accepting one another and understanding one another. And I hope that empathy isn't lost, and that critical thinking isn't lost, and that critical feeling isn't lost. And to touch on one thing that you spoke of about, it's called the observer effect. I'm not sure if you're familiar with quantum mechanics. Most people aren't, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, but the little that I do know about it is that you can fire rays of light on an atom, and you can change the direction. This is the observer effect. And people tend to confuse themselves with the object rather than the observed. So they confuse themselves with being the observer rather than the object. And this goes back to the Taoist warning and advice, which was, do not confuse the finger for the moon that it points at. Mm. So my fear is that we become in our unified state, if we are to arrive there, that we find another enemy to divide. But I really do hope that if you can finish up on one thing that you fear the most out of all of this.
Gosh. Yeah, I would fear the stickiness of polarization, in the sense that I think less so than in the case of post 9/11, we're still not seeing, I think, the same degree of unity that maybe you were referencing a moment ago. And because of how divisive things are, I'm not sure, I don't know who could emerge to be a unifying factor, because as you pointed out, and again, I would easily say that this is also inarguable, that the president has been an extremely divisive force.
Without a doubt.
Stoking the flames of partisanship, whether it's, talking about other countries or the media or politicians or people of a certain political persuasion. I think that we are severely lacking moral leadership. And I think it's really interesting, because the class that I teach, one of the ones I just wrapped up from last semester, was on using different international relations theories to understand the war in Iraq in 2003. And I always start the class off by showing students when President Bush made a public address to announce the war effort in Iraq. And it is just night and day compared to what we have now. And this is not to look back on the Bush presidency with rose-tinted glasses, but even if you didn't agree politically or were on the same religious side as the president, his demeanor was certainly different than what we have in power now. And I think that is the thing that our leadership is really missing, that Fauci, in a way, is trying his damnedest to try and pick up some slack for, by being modest and humble and not trying to stoke the flames of partisanship, and then having to realizing that he's walking a very tight rope, and that the president could say something to completely contradict him tomorrow, or, drag him through the mud by discrediting him or something like that. I think that's extremely volatile. And I think that we need a better leader. We need someone who could actually unify the country and could make people who have now been defriending each other, yelling at each other in the streets, punching each other for wearing certain shirts and things and hats, could say, you know what, let's stop this. Let's be Americans again. Let's work on things together. This president is fundamentally incapable of doing that. So we have the worst kind of person to lead us through this moment.
I could not agree more. And I hope you're in agreement that this has been a wonderful chat. Again, so I've become even a much bigger fan of yours throughout this conversation. I've learned a great deal, and I hope that everybody who's watched this has learned a great deal from your words, your experiences, and I hope that we all don't succumb to our fears.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and for having a great discussion. And I learned a lot myself. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
You're welcome, Josh. And this has been Conversations Under Quarantine with Professor Josh Gellers. Do you have a website, or do you have anything where your publications could be found that people who'd like to listen to your words or read your words could find them?
Yeah, so I have a website, which is pretty simple. It's www.joshgellers.com. And I'm unfortunately or fortunately very active on social media. So you can also find me on Twitter at Josh Gellers.
Excellent, Josh. Again, I look forward to maybe us speaking again. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And I hope that everything that you hope turns out to be true.
Thanks, Lance. Really appreciate it.
Take care.